Chapter 12 Vietnam Unified 1974 The Socialist Republic. Although the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in 1976 had officially reunified the country, Vietnam at peace faced formidable problems. In the South alone, millions of people had been made homeless by the war, and more than 1/7 of the population had been killed or wounded. The costs in the North were probably as high or higher. Plans to reconstruct the country called for the expansion of industry in the North and of agriculture in the South. Within 2 years of the communist victory, however, it became clear that Vietnam would face major difficulties in realizing its goals. Hanoi had been at war for more than a generation. Indeed, Ho Chi Minh had died in 1969, and the bureaucracy was poorly trained to deal with the problems of peacetime economic recovery. The government encountered considerable resistance to its policies, particularly in the huge metropolis of Saigon, renamed Ho Chi Minh City in 1976, where members of the commercial sector, many of whom were ethnic Chinese, sought to avoid cooperating in the new socialist economic measures and resisted assignment to new economic zones in the countryside. During the late 1970s, the country also suffered major floods and drought that severely reduced food production. When the regime suddenly announced a program calling for the socialization of industry and agriculture in the South in early 1978, hundreds of thousands of people, mainly ethnic Chinese, fled the country on foot or by boat. These internal difficulties were compounded by problems in foreign affairs. Perhaps unrealistically, the regime decided to pursue plans to form a close alliance with new revolutionary governments in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Such plans risked incurring not only the hostility of the United States, but also that of China, which had its own interests in those countries. As Sino-Vietnamese relations soured, Hanoi turned to Moscow and signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation tie-in with the Soviet Union. In the meantime, relations with the Revolutionary Democratic Kampuchea, Khmer Rouge, government in Cambodia rapidly deteriorated when it refused Hanoi's offer of a close relationship among the three countries that once formed French Indochina. Savage border fighting culminated in a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978. The Khmer Rouge were dislodged from power, and a pro-Vietnamese government was installed in Phnom Penh. Khmer Rouge forces now took refuge in isolated areas of the country and began a guerrilla war of resistance against the new government, the latter backed by some 200,000 Vietnamese troops. In the meantime, China launched a brief but fierce punitive invasion along the Sino-Vietnamese border in early 1979 in response to Vietnamese actions of industry and agriculture in the South in early 1978. Hundreds of thousands of people, mainly ethnic Chinese, fled the country on foot or by boat. These internal difficulties were compounded by problems in foreign affairs. Perhaps unrealistically, the regime decided to pursue plans to form a close alliance with new revolutionary governments in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. Such plans risked incurring not only the hostility of the United States, but also that of China, which had its own interests in those countries. As Sino-Vietnamese relations soured, Hanoi turned to Moscow and signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation tie-in with the Soviet Union. In the meantime, relations with the Revolutionary Democratic Kampuchea, Khmer Rouge, government in Cambodia rapidly deteriorated when it refused Hanoi's offer of a close relationship among the three countries that once formed French Indochina. Savage border fighting culminated in a Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in December 1978. The Khmer Rouge were dislodged from power, and a pro-Vietnamese government was installed in Phnom Penh. Khmer Rouge forces now took refuge in isolated areas of the country and began a guerrilla war of resistance against the new government, the latter backed by some 200,000 Vietnamese troops. In the meantime, China launched a brief but fierce punitive invasion along the Sino-Vietnamese border in early 1979 in response to Vietnamese actions in Cambodia. During the month-long war, the Chinese destroyed major Vietnamese towns and inflicted heavy damage in the frontier zone. But they also suffered heavy casualties from the Vietnamese defenders. Vietnam was now nearly isolated in the world, apart from the protégé regime in Phnom Penh and the government of Laos, which also depended heavily on Vietnamese aid for its survival. The country was at odds with the rest of its regional neighbors. The member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, opposed the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia and joined with China in supporting guerrilla resistance force, represented by the Khmer Rouge and various non-communist Cambodian groups. An economic trade embargo was imposed on Vietnam by the United States and most other Western countries. Only the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe stood by Vietnam. Under such severe external pressure, Vietnam suffered continuing economic difficulties. The cost of stationing troops in Cambodia and of maintaining a strong defensive position along the Chinese border was especially heavy. To make matters worse, the regime encountered continuing problems in integrating the southern provinces into a socialist economy. In the early 1980s, the government announced a number of reforms to spur the economy. Then, following the death of veteran party chief Lưu Duan in 1986 and his succession by the pro-reform Nguyen Van Linh, the party launched in focus. Khmer Rouge. Khmer Rouge was a radical communist movement that ruled Cambodia from 1975 to 1979 after winning power through a guerrilla war. It was purportedly set up in 1967 as the armed wing of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. Cambodia's communist movement originated in the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, which was formed in 1951 under the auspices of the Viet Minh of Vietnam. The party's largely French-educated Marxist leaders eventually renamed it the Communist Party of Kampuchea. By the late 1950s, the party's members were engaged in clandestine activities against the government of Prince Norodom Sihanouk. However, for many years, they made little headway against Sihanouk from their bases in remote jungle and mountain areas, partly because of Sihanouk's own popularity among the peasants whom the communists sought to incite to rebellion. After a right-wing military coup toppled Sihanouk in 1970, the Khmer Rouge entered into a political coalition with him. Thus, the Khmer Rouge finally began attracting increased support in the Cambodian countryside, a trend that was accelerated by the destructive U.S. bombing campaigns over Cambodia in the early 1970s. By this time, the Khmer Rouge were also receiving substantial aid from North Vietnam, which had withheld its support during the years of Sihanouk's rule. In a civil war that continued for nearly 5 years from 1970, the Khmer Rouge gradually expanded the areas of the Cambodian countryside under their control. Finally, in April 1975, Khmer Rouge forces mounted a victorious attack on the capital city of Phnom Penh and established a national government to rule Cambodia. The military leader of the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, became the new government's prime minister. The Khmer Rouge's rule over the next 4 years was marked by some of the worst excesses of any Marxist government in the 20th century, during which as many as 1.5 million Cambodians died and many of the country's professional and technical class were exterminated. The Khmer Rouge government was overthrown in 1979 by invading Vietnamese troops, who installed a puppet government propped up by Vietnamese aid and expertise. The Khmer Rouge retreated to remote areas and resumed guerrilla warfare, this time operating from bases near the border with Thailand and obtaining aid from China. In 1982, they formed a fragile coalition under the nominal leadership of Sen Auk, with two non-communist Khmer groups opposed to the Vietnamese-backed central government. The Khmer Rouge was the strongest partner in this coalition, which carried on guerrilla warfare until 1991. The Khmer Rouge opposed the United Nations sponsored peace settlement of 1991 and the multi-party elections in 1993. And they continued guerrilla warfare against the non-communist coalition government formed after those elections. Isolated in the remote western provinces of the country and increasingly dependent on gem smuggling for their funding. The Khmer Rouge suffered a series of military defeats and grew weaker from year to year. In 1995, many of their cadres accepted an offer of amnesty from the Cambodian government. And in 1996, one of their leading figures, Ieng Sari, defected along with several Thao San guerrillas under his command and signed a peace agreement with the government. The disarray within the organization intensified in 1997, when Pol Pot was arrested by other Khmer Rouge leaders and sentenced to life imprisonment. Pol Pot died in 1998, and soon afterward the surviving leaders of the Khmer Rouge defected or were imprisoned. Program of sweeping economic and institutional renovation, Doi Moi. Actual implementation, however, did not begin until 1988, when a deepening economic crisis and declining support from the Soviet Union compelled the government to slash spending, court foreign investment, and liberalize trade. Other policies essentially legalized free market activities that the government had previously tried to limit or suppress. Problems of modernization. These measures stabilized the economy. But the sudden collapse of communist rule in Eastern Europe and disintegration of the Soviet Union left Vietnam completely isolated. Having begun removing its armed forces from Cambodia in 1985, Vietnam completed withdrawal in September 1989 and intensified efforts to improve relations with its neighbors. A peace conference in Paris formally ended the Cambodian conflict in 1991 and provided United Nations supervision until elections could be held in 1993. The Cambodian settlement removed a key obstacle to normalizing relations with China, Japan, and Europe. The Vietnamese agreement to help the United States deter the fate of Americans missing in action encouraged the United States to lift the embargo in 1994 and establish diplomatic relations with Hanoi in 1995. Admission to membership in ASEAN in July 1995 symbolized Vietnam's full acceptance into the family of nations. The return of peace and stability to the region allowed Vietnam to concentrate on the economic reforms begun in the late 1980s. The government took a pragmatic approach, responding flexibly to domestic realities while seeking ideas from diverse international sources. Major components of reform included Institute, a relatively liberal foreign investment law, decollectivizing agriculture, ending fixed prices and subsidies, and Signify, reducing the number of state-owned enterprises. Results are on the whole favorable. The output of food staples per capita, after a half-century of decline, increased sufficiently for Vietnam to become a sizable exporter of rice in 1989. Job creation in the private sector made up for job losses in the public sector. Foreign investment spurred growth in crude oil production, light manufacture, and and tourism. Vietnam also redirected its trade in a remarkably short period of time from ex-communist countries to such new partners as Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Growth in the gross domestic product, GDP, averaged nearly 8% annually through the 1990s. With success, however, came a weakening of commitment to further change and renewed concern about preserving Vietnam's socialist orientation. One consequence was the continued prominence in the economy of state-owned enterprises, fewer than half of which were profitable, but which accounted for nearly one-third of GDP. Leaders also worried that the corruption, inequality, and materialism. In focus, the Palm-IA controversy. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accord was signed, officially bringing to an end the American war in Vietnam. One of the prerequisites for and provisions of the treaty was the return of all American prisoners of war, POWs. On February 12th, the first of 595 U.S. military and civilian POWs were released in Hanoi and flown directly to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. In the 1974 State of the Union address, Nixon told the American people that all our troops have returned from Southeast Asia, and they have returned with honor. But many Americans had started questioning whether, in fact, all POWs had been released. The Vietnam POW issue soon became a major controversy, prompting congressional investigations, partisan politics, the production of major motion pictures, and the formation of a number of POW and MIA, missing in action organizations. The uproar over POWs caused the Senate to form the Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs. Senator John Kerry, a veteran of the war, was appointed chairman. The controversy was fed by reported live sightings and photographs of Americans held in captivity. Investigations revealed that the photographs were phony and the sightings could not be verified. No credible evidence has ever been provided to substantiate the existence of American POWs in Vietnam. This, however, is not a definitive answer. The POW issue remained a significant public concern for a number of REA sons. It is argued that it was used to renege on Nixon's promise of billions of dollars of economic assistance to Vietnam. As a political tool to preclude the formalization of relations with Vietnam, as an election issue to gain the support of the families of servicemen missing in action, veterans, and the active military, and as a welfare system for the families of personnel missing in action. The POW-MIA issue in Vietnam is unique for a number of reasons. The Vietnam War was the first war lost by the United States. As a consequence, after the war, it was impossible to search the battlefields for remains. Because the country was never occupied, it was impossible to search the prisons and cemeteries. Additionally, Vietnam shared a common border with China and had close ties with the former Soviet Union, which resulted in unknown numbers of POWs being taken to China and possibly the Soviet Union. Much of Vietnam is covered with dense jungle. The geography, terrain, and climate make it exceedingly difficult to find and recover remains. These factors damaged the recovery efforts and precluded a comprehensive, accurate accounting. However, on July 11th, 1995, the administration of U.S. President Bill Clinton extended diplomatic recognition to Vietnam, which gave Americans greater access to the country. In 1973, when the last known American POWs were released, more than 2,500 U.S. servicemen were designated missing in action. As of August 2004, more than 1,800 servicemen still were unaccounted for. The U.S. Department of Defense lists 687 American POWs returned alive from the Vietnam War. North Vietnam acknowledged that 55 Americans died in captivity. POWs in the Hanoi prison system endeavored to maintain a registry of captive Americans. They concluded that at least 766 American POWs entered the system. POWs were initially held in 4 prisons in Hanoi and 6 facilities within 50 miles of the city. The Hanoi Hilton was the largest prison. No POW ever escaped from Hanoi. More than 80% of the POWs held in North Vietnam were aircrew personnel, with 332 from the U.S. Air Force, 146 from the U.S. Navy, and 26 from the U.S. Marine Corps. POWs held in North Vietnam were used for propaganda, psychological warfare, and negotiating purposes. POWs were tortured, isolated, and psychologically abused in violation of the 1949 Geneva Convention, to which North Vietnam was a signatory. Some POWs were paraded before reporters and foreign tours and forced to confess to war crimes against the people of Vietnam. Others resisted torture and refused to comply. The Pentagon made no effort to court-martial those individuals who cooperated with the enemy, with the one exception of Robert Garwood, who did not return to the United States until 1979. However, most POWs served with honor and dignity. Because the average aviator was older and more mature, more highly trained, and better educated than the average soldier in Vietnam, they fared much better in captivity. Army Special Forces Captain Floyd James Thompson, who was captured on March 26, 1964, was the longest-held POW. Navy Lieutenant Everett Alvarez, who was shot down August 5, 1964, was the first pilot captured. Air Force Colonel John Flynn was the highest-ranking POW. Associated with the new market economy, could undermine support for the party. In 1991, Nguyen Van Linh yielded the party's chairmanship to Du Muoi, a cautious, consensus-seeking politician. Although a new constitution enacted in 1992 was seen as a step toward loosening party control of the government, the party remained unwilling to share power with non-communist elements. Muoi's replacement, Look Ha Phu, chosen in 1997 after months of bitter FAC-Tinal infighting, lacked both the power and the determination to accelerate the pace of reform. Internal opposition to FER, their liberalization, caused Vietnam in 1999 to decide, after years of negotiation, not to sign a trade agreement with the United States that would have also secured membership in the World Trade Organization, WTO. In the face of relentless globalization, Vietnam was threatened by paralysis on account of its reluctance to reform its political institutions. Impatience with government corruption and slowing economic growth, exacerbated by the Asian economic crisis of the late 1990s, catalyzed large-scale demonstrations early in the 21st century. The demonstrations, in turn, ultimately contributed to the senior party leader's decision to replace Look Ha Phu with Nguyen Duc Man in April 2001. The new party leader immediately took steps to curb corruption and to integrate Vietnam more fully into the global economy. Once again, the country's GDP experienced a surge of growth. Trade negotiations with the United States were rekindled, and an accord was signed later that year. At the end of 2006, Vietnam ratified the Achin Agreement to become the WTO's 150th member in January 2007. Chapter 13. Vietnam and the Cold War. America's suicide attempt. As the Vietnam War began to recede into the past, the entire episode, from a neutral perspective, increasingly came to seem incredible. That the most powerful and wealthy nation on Earth should undertake 15 years of wasting conflict against a tiny state 10,000 miles, 16,093 km, from its shores, and lose, almost justifies the historian Paul Johnson's phrase, America's suicide attempt. Yet the destructive and futile U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia was a product of a series of trends that had been maturing since World War II. The early Cold War gave rise to U.S. leadership in the containment of communism. Decolonization then thrust the United States into a role described by advocate and critic alike as the world's policeman, protector and benefactor of the weak new governments of the Third World. The potential of guerrilla insurgency, demonstrated in Josip Broz Tito's resistance to the Nazis and especially in the post-war victories of Mao Zedong, the Viet Minh, and Fidel Castro, made it the preferred mode for revolutionary action around the world. The emerging nuclear stalemate alerted Washington to the need to prepare for fight, Limited, sometimes called brush fire, war sponsored by the Soviet Union or China through proxies in the Third World. In this era of Khrushchevian and Maoist assertiveness, the United States could not allow any of its client states to fall to a communist war of national liberation, lest it lose prestige and credibility to Moscow and Beijing. Finally, the domino theory, to the effect that the fall of one country would inexorably lead to the immunization of its neighbors, magnified the importance of even the smallest state and guaranteed that sooner or later the United States would become gled under the worst possible conditions. One, or even all of the assumptions under which the United States became involved in Vietnam may have been faulty, but very few in the government and the public questioned them until long after the country was committed. By 1961, Ngo Dinh Diem's fledgling government in South Vietnam was receive more U.S. aid per capita than any other country except Laos and South Korea. Authoritative reports detailed both the Viet Cong's campaign of terror against government officials in the South and widespread discontent over Diem's corrupt and imperious rule. In the face of both Nikita Khrushchev's renewed vow to support wars of national liberation and Charles de Gaulle's warning, I predict you will sink step by step into a bottomless military and political quagmire. John F. Kennedy chose Vietnam as a test case for American theories of state building and counterinsurgency. He approved a proposal by Walt Rostow and Gen. Maxwell Taylor to assign advisors to every level of Saigon's government and military, and the number of Americans in Vietnam grew from 800 to 11,000 by the end of 1962. Primary document, John F. Kennedy's A Long Twilight Struggle speech. In many speeches, notably the following address delivered at the University of Washington on November 16, 1961, President Kennedy emphasized that America did not have unlimited power to control the world. He warned that those people who sought easy answers, who demanded either peace at any price or total victory, who saw the alternatives as being either red or dead, were equally wrong and that their solutions would be equally disastrous. The only sane and effective foreign policy in a nuclear age was one that combined willingness to negotiate and a compromise with a determination to defend basic values. Bulletin, December 4th, 1961. Diplomacy and Defense, a Test of National Maturity. We increase our arms at a heavy cost, primarily to make certain that we will not have to use them. We must face up to the chance of war if we are to maintain the peace. We must work with certain countries lacking in freedom in order to strengthen the cause of freedom. We find some who call themselves neutrals who are our friends and sympathetic to us, and others who call themselves neutral who are unremittingly hostile to us. And as the most powerful defender of freedom on earth, we find ourselves unable to escape the responsibilities of freedom and yet unable to exercise it without restraints imposed by the very freedoms we seek to protect. We cannot, as a free nation, compete with our adversaries in tactics of terror, assassination, false promises, counterfeit mobs, and crises. We cannot, under the scrutiny of a free press and public, tell different stories to different audiences, foreign, domestic, friendly, and hostile. We cannot abandon the slow processes of consulting with our allies to match the swift expediencies of those who merely dictate to their satellites. We can neither abandon nor control the international organization in which we now cast less than 1% of the vote in the General Assembly. We possess weapons of tremendous power, but they are least effective in combating the weapons most often used by freedom's foes: subversion, infiltration, guerrilla war, fair and civil disorder. We send arms to other peoples, just as we can send them the ideals of democracy in which we believe, but we cannot send them the will to use those arms or to abide by those ideals. And while we believe not only in the force of arms, but in the force of right and reason, we have learned that reason does not always appeal to unreasonable men, that it is not always true that a soft answer turneth away wrath, and that right does not always make might. In short, we must face problems which do not lend themselves to easy or quick or permanent solutions. And we must face the fact that the United States is neither omnipotent or omniscient, that we are only 6% of the world's population, that we cannot impose our will upon the other, 94% of mankind, that we cannot right every wrong or reverse each adversity, and that for there cannot be an American solution to every world problem. If vital interests under duress can be preserved by peaceful means, negotiations will find that out. This nation cannot abdicate to its adversaries the task of choosing the forum and the framework and the time. In short, we are neither warmongers nor appeasers, neither hard nor soft. We are Americans, determined to defend the frontiers of freedom by an honorable peace if peace is possible, but by arms if arms are used against us. And if we are to move forward in that spirit, we shall need all the calm and thoughtful citizens that this great university can produce, all the light they can shed, all the wisdom they can bring to bear. It is customary, both here and around the world, to regard life in the United States as easy. Our advantages are many, but more than any other people on earth, we bear burdens and accept risks unprecedented in their size and their duration, not for ourselves alone, but for all who wish to be free. No other generation of free men in any country has ever faced so many and such difficult challenges. Not even those who lived in the days when this university was founded in 1861. This nation was then torn by war. This territory had only the simplest elements of civilization, and this city had barely begun to function. But a university was one of their earliest thoughts, and they summed it up in the motto that they adopted: "Let there be light." What more can be said today regarding all the dark and tangled problems we face then? Let there be light. Ho Chi Minh's North Vietnamese considered the struggle against Diem and his American sponsors merely the next phase of a war that had begun against the Japanese and had continued. D against the French. Their determination to unify Vietnam and conquer all of Indochina was the principal dynamic behind the conflict. The total number of communist troops in the South grew by recruitment and infiltration from some. 7,000 in 1960 to more than 100,000 by 1964. Most were guerrilla militiamen who served also as local party cadres. Above them were the Viet Cong, formerly the National Liberation Front, or NLF, deployed in regional military units. And units of the People's Army of North Vietnam, PAVN, entering the south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. U.S. Special Forces tried to counter communist control of the countryside with a strategic hamlet program, a tactic used with success by the British in Malaya. Diem instituted a policy of relocating the rural population of South Vietnam in order to isolate the communists. The program caused widespread resentment, while Diem's persecution of local Buddhist sects provided a rallying point for protests. When Buddhist monks resorted to dramatic self-immolation in front of Western news cameras, Kennedy secretly instructed Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge to approve a military coup. On November 1, 1963, Diem was overthrown and murdered. South Vietnam then underwent a succession of coups d'etat that undermined all pretense that the United States was defending democracy. The struggle was thenceforth viewed in Washington as a military effort to buy time for state-build ING and the training of the South Vietnamese Army, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, YARVN. When two American destroyers exchanged fire with a North Vietnamese torpedo boat 8 miles, 12.8 kilometers, off the North's coast in August 1964, an event whose occurrence was later disputed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution authorizing the President to take whatever measures he deemed necessary to protect American lives in Southeast Asia. Lyndon B. Johnson held off on escalating the war during the 1964 electoral campaign, but in February 1965 ordered sustained bombing of North Vietnam and sent the first U.S. combat units to the south. By June, U.S. troops in Vietnam numbered 74,000. The Soviet Union reacted to American escalation by trying to reconvene the Geneva Conference and bring pressure to bear on the United States to submit to the peaceful reunification of Vietnam. China bluntly refused to encourage a negotiated settlement and insisted that the USSR help North Vietnam by pressuring the United States elsewhere. The Soviets, in turn, resented Beijing's assertion of leadership in the communist world and had no desire to provoke new crises with Washington. The North Vietnamese were caught in the middle. Ho's ties were to Moscow, but geography obliged him to favor Beijing. Hence, North Vietnam joined in boycotting the March 1965 Communist Conference in Moscow. The Soviets, however, dared not ignore the Vietnam War lest they confirm Chinese accusations of Soviet revisionism, the conduct and cost of the war. Meanwhile, the United States slid ineluctably into the quagmire predicted by de Gaulle. U.S. forces reached a peak of 543,000 men in 1969. Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines also sent small contingents, and South Korea contributed 50,000 men. The U.S. strategy was to employ mobility based on helicopters and firepower to wear down the enemy by attrition at minimal cost in U.S. lives. The war of attrition on the ground, like the bombing in the North, was designed less to destroy the enemy's ability to wage war than to demonstrate to the enemy that he could not win and to bring him to the bargaining table. But stalemate suited Hanoi, which could afford to wait, while it was anathema to the Americans. Johnson's popularity fell steadily. Most Americans favored more vigorous prosecution to end the war, but a growing number advocated withdrawal. Anti-war dissent grew and spread and overlapped with sweeping and violent demands for social change. The American foreign policy consensus that had sustained containment since the 1940s was shattered by Vietnam. In retrospect, Johnson's attempt to prevent the war from disturbing his own domestic program was vain, and his strategic conception was grounded in folly and hubris. He and his advisors had no clear notion of what the application of American force was supposed to achieve. It was merely assumed to be invincible. Hanoi understood that the classic Maoist strategy of isolating cities by revolutionizing the countryside was inapplicable to Vietnam because the CTES could still hold out with foreign support. Accordingly, in mid-1967, the North Vietnamese Politburo approved a plan for urban attacks throughout South Vietnam. General Vo Nguyen Giap insisted, however, that NLF guerrillas, not PAVN units, be risked. The expectation was that direct attacks on cities would undercut American claims of pacification and magnify domestic American dissent. On January 30th, 1968, the Tet holiday, during which many ARVN troops were home on leave, an estimated 84,000 communist troops infiltrated South Vietnamese cities, attacked government installations, and even penetrated the American embassy in Saigon. The Tet offensive was carried out at a terrible cost to communist strength. But American press reports turned the offensive into a psychological defeat for the United States. Instead of ordering a counterattack, Johnson removed himself from the 1968 presidential campaign, ordered a bombing halt, and pledged to devote the rest of his administration to the quest for peace. Negotiations began in Paris, but the rest of the year was spent bickering over procedural issues. For more than 25 years after 1941, the United States had maintained an unprecedented depth of involvement in world affairs. In 1968, Vietnam finally forced Americans to face the limits of their resources and will. Whoever succeeded Johnson would have little choice but to find a way to escape from Vietnam and reduce American global responsibilities. Détente as realism. After 8 years in the shadow of Dwight D. Eisenhower and 8 more years out of office, Richard M. Nixon brought to the presidency in 1969 rich experience as an observer of foreign affairs and shrewd notions about how to prevent the American retreat from global commitments from turning into a rout. In broad outlines, the Nixon strategy included a phased withdrawal of ground forces from Vietnam, a negotiated set, Clement saving the Saigon regime, détente with the USSR, resumption of relations with mainland China, and military support for selected regional powers that permitted them to take over as local policemen in lieu of direct American involvement. In a period of just 4 years, 1969 to 72, the United States abandoned once unshakable Cold War attitudes toward the communist nations, while scaling back its own exposure in response to the Sino-Soviet split, imminent Soviet strategic parity, and the economic and psychological constraints on U.S. action stemming from the new American imperative of no more Vietnams. Nixon believed that his own record as an anti-communist and tough negotiator would quiet conservative opposition to détente, while liberals would find themselves outflanked on their own peace issue. In both ends and means, American foreign policy evinced a new realism in stark contrast to the pay any price, bear any burden mentality of the Kennedy-Johnson years. In his inaugural address, Nixon spoke instead of an era of negotiation. Détente, however, was not meant to replace the abiding post-war American strategy of containment. Rather, it was meant to be a less confrontational method of containing communist power through diplomatic accords and a flexi-bly system of rewards and punishments by which Washington might moderate Soviet behavior. Journalists dubbed this tactic linkage, insofar as the United States would link positive inducements, arms control, technology transfers, grain sales, to expected Soviet reciprocity in other areas, restraint in promoting revolutionary movements. Nixon had no illusions that U.S. Soviet competition would disappear, but he expected that this carrot-and-stick approach would establish rules of the game and recognize spheres of influence, pulling the Soviets into a network of agreements, and thus giving them a stake in the status quo would create a stable structure of peace. Finally, expanding economic and cultural ties might even serve to open up Soviet society. By 1971, Leonid Brezhnev, now established as the new Soviet leader, was ready to welcome American overtures for a variety of reasons. In 1968, relations with the Eastern European satellites had flared up again when leaders of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party under Alexander Dubček initiated reforms promoting democratization and free speech. A wave of popular demonstrations added momentum to liberalization during this Prague Spring, until on August 20th, the USSR led neighboring Warsaw Pact armies in a military invasion of Czechoslovakia. Dubček was ousted and the reforms undone. The ostensible justification for this latest Soviet repression of freedom in its empire came to be known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Each of our parties is responsible not only to its work, ing class and its people, but also to the international working class, the world communist movement. The USSR asserted its right to intervene in any communist state to prevent the success of counter-revolutionary elements. Needless to say, the Chinese were fearful that the Brezhnev Doctrine might be applied to them. In 1969, they accused the USSR of social imperialism and provoked hundreds of armed clashes on the borders of Xinjiang and Manchuria. Soviet forces arrayed against China, already raised from 12 weak divisions in 1961 to 25 full ones, now grew to 55 DV, backed by 120 SS, 11 nuclear missiles. In August 1969, a Soviet diplomat had carefully inquired about the likely American reaction to a Soviet nuclear strike against China. In sum, the need to repair the Soviet image in the wake of the Prague Spring and the fear of dangerous relations with Beijing and Washington at the same time, as well as the chronic Soviet need for agricultural imports and access to superior Western technology, were all powerful incentives for seeking détente. From a longer perspective, however, détente had been the strategy of the USSR ever since 1956 under the rubric peaceful coexistence. Brezhnev repeated Khrushchev's assertion that Soviet nuclear parity took the military leverage from the hands of the bourgeois world, forcing it to accept the legitimate interests of other states, to treat the USSR as an equal, and to acquiesce in the success of progressive and revolutionary struggle. Détente was thus for the Soviets a natural expression of the new correlation of forces, a means of guiding the weakened Americans through the transition to a new phase of history, and was certainly not meant to preserve the status quo or liberalize the USSR. One Western proponent of détente described the Soviet conception of it as a way to make the world safe for historical change, and pointed out the implicit double standard, i.e., that it was admissible for the USSR to continue the struggle against the capitalist world ing détente, but a contradiction for the Western powers to struggle against communism. From the Marxist point of view, however, this was merely another reflection of objective reality. Now that nuclear balance was a fact, greater weight accrued to conventional military strength and popular political action, each of which strongly favored the socialist bloc. The contrasting U.S. and Soviet conceptions of détente would eventually scotch the hopes placed in it on both sides. From 1969 to 1972, however, those differences were not yet apparent. While the immediate incentives for a relaxation of tensions were irresistible. Scaling back U.S. commitments. The first indications of a new American sense of limits in foreign policy were in the economic sphere. Since World War II, the global market economy had rested on the Bretton Woods monetary system, based on a strong American dollar tied to gold. Beginning in 1958, the United States began to run annual foreign exchange deficits, resulting partly from the costs of maintaining U.S. forces overseas. For this reason, and because their own exports benefited from an artificially strong dollar, the Europeans and Japanese tolerated the U.S. gold drain and used their ING fund of Eurodollars to back loans and commerce. By the mid-1960s, de Gaulle began to criticize the United States for exploiting its leadership role to export its inflation to foreign holders of dollars. The Johnson administration's Vietnam deficits then added the prospect of internal American inflation. By 1971, the American economic situation warranted emergency measures. Nixon imposed wage and price controls to stem inflation, and Secretary of the Treasury John Connally abruptly suspended the convertibility of dollars to gold. The dollar was allowed to float against undervalued currencies like the Deutsche Mark and yen, in consequence of which foreign holders of dollars took sharp losses and foreign exporters faced stiffer competition from American goods. New agreements in December 1971 stabilized the dollar at a rate 12% below Bretton Woods, but the United States had sorely tried Allied loyalty. The American retreat from an overextended financial position and insistence that its allies share the burden of stabilize ING the U.S. balance of payments was the economic analog to the Nixon doctrine in military affairs. The new president enunciated this doctrine in an impromptu news conference on Guam during his July 1969 trip to welcome home the Apollo 11 astronauts from the moon. Nixon announced that the United States would no longer send Americans to fight for Asian nations, but would confine itself to logistical and economic support. Asian hands must shape the Asian future. In accord with this effort to shift more of the burden of containment to threatened peoples themselves, Nixon planned to assist regional pro-Western powers like Iran in becoming bulwarks of stability by providing them with sophisticated American weapons before the Nixon doctrine could be credible. However, the president had to extricate the United States from Vietnam. In March 1969, he outlined a policy of Vietnamization, comprising a phased withdrawal of American ground troops and additional material and advisory support to make the ARVN self-sufficient. Nixon also hoped to enlist the Soviets in the cause of peace, but Moscow had less influence over Hanoi than he imagined and could not afford to be seen as a ING the United States. Nixon then shifted to a subtler approach. Long-term pressure on Hanoi combined with better relations with both communist giants. Late in 1969, secret talks began in Paris between Henry Kissinger, Nixon's advisor for national security, and the North Vietnamese Politburo member Lu Duc, though. At the same time, however, Nixon stepped up pressure on the North. When the anti-communist General Lon Nol overthrew Prince Sihanouk in Cambodia in March 1970, Nixon acceded to the U.S. Army's long-standing desire to destroy communist sanctuaries inside that country. The USCRVN operation fell short of its promise and provoked protests at home and abroad. Despite public disfavor, and congressional attempts to limit such actions. Nixon ordered continued secret American bombing inside Cambodia and also supported an ARVN operation into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The opening to China and Ostpolitik. The linchpin of Nixon's strategy for a settlement in Vietnam was détente with Moscow and Beijing. He was known as a firm supporter of the nationalist regime on Taiwan, but he had softened his stance against mainland China before taking office. In 1969, he moved to signal Beijing through the good offices of de Gaulle and Yahya Khan of Pakistan. Direct contacts, conducted through the Chinese embassy in Warsaw, were broken off after the 1970 USSR attacks on Cambodia, but Nixon and Kissinger remained hopeful. The Cultural Revolution ended in a serious power struggle in the Chinese leadership. Army Commander Lin Biao opposed relations with the United States, but died when his plane crashed in unclear circumstances. Zhou Enlai and Mao, presumably, contemplated the value of an American counterweight to the Soviets, concessions on the status of Taiwan, and technology transfers. The Nixon Doctrine also promised to remove the obnoxious U.S. military presence in Asia. The Pakistani Channel bore fruit in December 1970, when Yahya Khan returned from Beijing with an invitation for an American envoy to discuss Taiwan. The following April, the Chinese made the surprising public gesture of inviting an American table tennis team to the championship tournament in Beijing. This episode of ping-pong diplomacy was followed by a secret trip to Beijing by Kissinger. Kissinger's talks with Zhou and Mao yielded an American promise to remove U.S. forces from Taiwan in return for Chinese support of a negotiated settlement in Vietnam. The Chinese also agreed to a presidential visit in February 1972. The American people's long-latent fascination with China immediately revived, and Nixon's trip was a sensation. Primary document: the Shanghai Communiqué. Probably the most notable and surprising achievement of President Richard Nixon's first term was his visit to China in February 1972. The visit had been arranged through the mediation of National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger on a secret trip to Beijing in July 1971 to meet with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. But there had been hints earlier in the year of a thaw in the relations between the two nations. On March 15, 1971, the president had announced a discontinuation of the travel ban to China, thus enabling the U.S. table tennis team to visit there in April. And on April 14th, he relaxed the trade embargo that had been in effect for a quarter of a century. The following selection is from the joint communiqué issued at Shanghai on February 27, 1972, at the end of the president's visit. Department of State Bulletin, March 20, 1972. During the visit, extensive, earnest, and frank discussions were held between President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai on the normalization of relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, as well as on other matters of interest to both sides. In addition, Secretary of State William Rogers and Foreign Minister Xi Pengfei held talks in the same spirit. The leaders of the People's Republic of China and the United States of America found it beneficial to have this opportunity, after so many years without contact, to present candidly to one another their views on a variety of issues. They reviewed the international situation in which important changes and great upheavals are taking place and expounded their respective posy, tie-ins, and attitudes. The U.S. side stated, "Peace in Asia and peace in the world requires efforts both to reduce immediate tensions and to eliminate the basic causes of conflict. The United States will work for a just and secure peace, just because it fulfills the aspirations of peoples and nations for freedom and progress. Secure, because it removes the danger of foreign aggression. The United States supports individual freedom and social progress for all the peoples of the world, free of outside pressure or intervention. The United States believe that the effort to reduce tensions is served by improving communication between countries that have different ideologies so as to lessen the risks of confrontation through accident, miscalculation, or misunderstanding. Countries should treat each other with mutual respect and be willing to compete peacefully, letting performance be the ultimate judge. No country should claim infallibility, and each country should be prepared to re-examine its own attitudes for the common good. The United States stressed that the peoples of Indochina should be allowed to determine their destiny without outside intervention. Its constant primary objective has been a negotiated solution. The 8-point proposal put forward by the Republic of Vietnam and the United States on January 27, 1972, represents a basis for the attainment of that objective. In the absence of a negotiated settlement, the United States envisages the ultimate withdrawal of all U.S. forces from the region consistent with the aim of self-determination for each country of Indochina. The United States will maintain its close ties with and support for the Republic of Korea. The United States will support efforts of the Republic of Korea to seek a relaxation of tension and increase communication in the Korean Peninsula. The United States places the highest value on its friendly relations with Japan. It will continue to develop the existing close bonds. Consistent with the United Nations Security Council resolution of December 21, 1971, the United States favors the continuation of the ceasefire between India and Pakistan and the withdrawal of all military forces to within their own territories and to their own sides of the ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir. The United States supports the right of the peoples of South Asia to shape their own future in peace, free of military threat, and without having the area become the subject of great power rivalry. The Chinese side stated, "Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. Countries want independence. Nations want liberation, and the people want revolution. This has become the irresistible trend of history. All nations, big or small, should be equal. Big nations should not bully the small, and strong nations should not bully the weak. China will never be a superpower, and it opposes hegemony and power politics of any kind." The Chinese side stated that it firmly supports the struggles of all the oppressed people and nations for freedom and liberation, and that the people of all countries have the right to choose our social systems according to their own wishes and the right to safeguard the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of their own countries and oppose foreign aggression, interference, control, and subversion. All foreign troops should be withdrawn to their own countries. The Chinese side expressed its firm support to the peoples of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in their efforts for the attainment of their goal, and its firm support to the 7-point proposal of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam and the elaboration of February this year on the 2 key problems in the proposal, and to the joint declaration of the Summit Conference of the Indo-Chinese Peoples. It firmly supports the 8-point program for the peaceful unification of Korea put forward by the government of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea on April 12, 1971, and to stand for the abolition of the UN Commission for the Unification and Rehabilitation of Korea. It firmly opposes the revival and outward expansion of Japanese militarism and firmly supports the Japanese people's desire to build an independent, democratic, peaceful, and neutral Japan. It firmly maintains that India and Pakistan should, in accordance with the United Nations resolutions on the India-Pakistan question, immediately withdraw all their forces to their respective territories and to their own sides of the ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir and firmly supports the Pakistan government and people in TH. EIR struggle to preserve their independence and sovereignty, and the people of Jammu and Kashmir in their struggle for the right of self-determination. There are essential differences between China and the United States in their social systems and foreign policies. However, the two sides agreed that countries, regardless of their social systems, should conduct their relations on the principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, non-aggression against other states, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. International disputes should be settled on this basis, without resorting to the use or threat of force. The United States and the People's Republic of China are prepared to apply these principles to their mutual relations. With these principles of international relations in mind, the two sides stated that progress toward the normalization of relations between China and the United States is in the interests of all countries. Both wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. Neither should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. And neither is prepared to negotiate on behalf of any third party or to enter into agreements or understandings with the other directed at other states. Both sides are of the view that it would be against the interests of the peoples of the world for any major country to collude with another against other countries, or for major countries to divide up the world into spheres of interest. The two sides reviewed the long-standing serious disputes between China and the United States. The Chinese side reaffirmed its position. The Taiwan question is the crucial question obstructing the normalization of relations between China and the United States. The government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government of China. Taiwan is a province of China which has long been returned to the motherland. The liberation of Taiwan is China's inter-NAL affair in which no other country has the right to interfere, and all U.S. forces and military installations must be withdrawn from Taiwan. The Chinese government firmly opposes any activities which aim at the creation of one China, one Taiwan, one China, two governments, two Chinas, and independent Taiwan, or advocate that the status of Taiwan remains to be determined. The U.S. side declared, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China, and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. With this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all U.S. forces and military installations from Taiwan. In the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes. The two sides agreed that it is desirable to broaden the understanding between the two POPs. To this end, they discuss specific areas in such fields as science, technology, culture, sports, and journalism, in which people-to-people contacts and exchanges would be mutually beneficial. Each side undertakes to facilitate the further development of such contacts and exchanges. Both sides view bilateral trade as another area from which mutual benefit can be derived, and agreed that economic relations based on equality and mutual benefit are in the interest of the peoples of the two countries. They agree to facilitate the progressive development of trade between their two countries. The two sides agreed that they will stay in contact through various channels, including the sending of a senior U.S. representative to Beijing from time to time for concrete consultations to further the normalization of relations between the two countries and continue to exchange views on issues of common interest. The two sides expressed the hope that the gains achieved during this visit would open up new prospect for the relations between the two countries. They believed that the normalization of rela tie-ins between the two countries is not only in the interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the relaxation of tension in Asia and the world. The Soviets watched with palpable discomfort as Nixon and Mao embraced and saluted each other's flags, and they quickly raised the premium on improving relations with Washington. Efforts to this end have been frustrated by a series of CRISES, a buildup of Soviet jets in Egypt and Jordan, the discovery of a Soviet submarine base under construction in Cuba in 1970, and Nixon's escalations of the war in Southeast Asia. Substantial moves toward East-West détente had already been made in Europe, however. Following de Gaulle's lead, the West German Foreign Minister, Willy Brandt, a socialist and former mayor of West Berlin, had made overtures toward Moscow. After becoming chancellor in 1969, he pursued a thorough Ostpolitik, Eastern policy, that culminated in treaties with the USSR, August 1970. Renouncing the use of force in their rela tie-ins and with Poland, December 1970. Recognizing Germany's 1945 losses east of the Oder-Neisse line. Brandt also recognized the East German government, December 1972, and expanded commercial relations with other Eastern European regimes. Both German states were admitted to the UN in 1973. Support for Ostpolitik among West Germans reflected the growing belief that German reunification tie-in would more likely be achieved through détente rather than confrontation with the Soviet bloc. The United States, Britain, and France seconded Brandt's efforts by concluding a new four-power accord with the USSR on Berlin in September 1971. The Soviets made what they considered a major concession by agreeing to retain their responsibility under the Potsdam Accord for access to West Berlin and achieved in return Western recognition of the status quo in Eastern Europe and access to West German technology and credits. ARMS limitation. Negotiations. The centerpiece of a bilateral U.S. Soviet détente, however, had to be the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which began in 1969. After a decade of determined research and deployment, the Soviet Union had pulled ahead of the United States in long-range missiles and was catching up in submarine-launched missiles and in long-range bombers. Indeed, it had been American policy since the mid-1960s to permit the Soviets to achieve parity in order to stabilize the regime of mutual deterrence. Stability was threatened, however, from the technological quarter with the development of multiple independently targeted vehicles, MIRVs, by which several warheads, each aimed at a different target, could be carried on one missile, and anti-ballistic missiles, ABMs, which might allow one side to strike first while shielding itself from retaliation. In the arcane province of strategic theory, therefore, offense, long-range missiles, became defense, and defense, ABM, offense. Johnson had favored a thin ABM system to protect the United States from a Chinese attack, and in 1969 Nixon won Senate approval of ABM deployment by a single vote. He intended, however, to use the program as a bargain chip. The Soviets had actually deployed a rudimentary ABM system, but were anxious to halt the U.S. program before superior American technology left theirs behind. The public SALT talks stalled, but back-channel negotiations between Kissinger and Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin produced agreement in principle in May 1971 to limit long-range missiles and ABM deployment. The American opening to China made the Soviets increasingly eager for a prompt agreement and summit meeting. while the Americans hoped that Moscow would encourage North Vietnam to be forthcoming in the peace talks. Since 1968, North Vietnamese negotiators had demanded satisfaction of Premier Pham Van Dong's 4 points of 1965, including cessation of all U.S. military activity in Indochina, termina tie-in of foreign military alliances with Saigon, a coalition government in the South that included the NLF, and reunify Cat Island of Vietnam. The United States demanded withdrawal of all foreign troops from the South, including the PAVN. This deadlock, plus Hanoi's anxiety over the possible effects of détente, prompted another North Vietnamese bid for victory on the battlefield. In March 1972, they committed 10 of their 13 divisions to a massive offensive. Nixon responded by ordering the resumption of bombing of the North for the first time since 1969 and the mining of the harbor at Haiphong, North Vietnam's major port. The offensive stalled. Nixon's retaliation against North Vietnam prompted speculation that the USSR would cancel the planned MIT meeting, but Soviet desire for détente prevailed. Kissinger visited Moscow in April 1972 to work out details on SALT and draft a charter for détente. Nixon instructed him to emphasize the need for a single standard. We could not accept the proposition that the Soviet Union had the right to support liberation movements throughout the world while insisting on the Brezhnev doctrine inside the satellite orbit. The Soviets, however, refused to make explicit concessions and define détente as a means of preventing the inevitable struggle between progressive and reactionary forces from escalating into war. The result was a vague statement of 12 basic principles of mutual relations, committing the two parties to peaceful coexistence and normal relations based on sovereignty, equality, non-interference in internal affairs, and mutual advantage. Nixon then proceeded to Moscow in May 1972 and signed 10 documents providing for cooperation in economics, science and technology, outer space, medicine, health, and the environment. Most important were the SALT Accords, an interim agreement limiting ballistic missile deployment for 5 years, and the ABM Treaty limiting each side to 2 ABM. In focus, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. Negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union aimed at curtailing the manufacture of strategic missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons were known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. The first agreements, known as SALT I and SALT II, were signed by the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1972 and 1979, respectively, and were intended to restrain the arms race in strategic, long-range, or intercontinental ballistic missiles armed with nuclear weapons. First suggested by U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1967, strategic arms limitation talks were agreed on by the two superpowers in the summer of 1968, and full-scale negotiations began in November 1969. Of the resulting complex of agreements, SALT I, the most important were the Treaty on Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM systems and the Interim Agreement and Protocol on Limitation of Strategic Offensive Weapons. Both were signed by President Richard M. Nixon for the United States and Leonid Brezhnev, General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, for the USSR on May 26, 1972, at a summit meeting in Moscow. The ABM Treaty regulated anti-ballistic missiles that could theoretically be used to destroy incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, launched by the other superpower. The treaty limited each side to only one ABM deployment area, i.e., missile launching site, and 100 intercept TOR missiles. These limitations prevented either party from defending more than a small fraction of its entire territory, and thus kept both sides subject to the deterrent effect of the other strategic forces. The ABM Treaty was ratified by the U.S. Senate on August 3, 1972. The interim agreement froze each side's number of ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, at current levels for 5 years, pending negotiation of a more detailed SALT II. As an executive agreement, it did not require U.S. Senate ratification, but it was approved by Congress in a joint resolution. The SALT II negotiations opened late in 1972 and continued for 7 years. A basic problem in these negotiations was the asymmetry between the strategic forces of the two countries, the USSR, having concentrated on missiles with large warheads, while the United States had Devil, op-ed smaller missiles of greater accuracy. Questions also arose as to new technologies under development, matters of definition, and methods of verification. As finally negotiated, the SALT II Treaty set limits on the number of strategic launchers, i.e., missiles that could be equipped with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles (MIRVs), with the object of deferring the time when both sides' land-based ICBM systems would become vulnerable to attack from such missiles. Limits were put on the number of MIRVed ICBMs, MIRVed SLBMs, heavy, i.e., long-range, bombers, and the total number of strategic launchers. The treaty set an overall limit of about 2,400 of all such weapon systems for each side. The SALT II Treaty was signed by President Jimmy Carter and Brezhnev in Vienna on June 18, 1979, and was submitted to the U.S. Senate for ratification shortly thereafter. But renewed tensions between the superpowers prompted Carter to remove the treaty from Senate consideration in January 1980, after the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. The United States and the Soviet Union voluntarily observed the arms limits agreed upon in SALT II in subsequent years, however. Meanwhile, the renewed negotiations that opened between the two superpowers in Geneva in 1982 took the name of Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START. Sites, one protecting the national capital, the other a long-range missile site. The treaty also enjoined the signatories not to interfere with each other's national tech, nickel means of verification, a de facto recognition of each side's space-based reconnaissance satellites. The preliminary SALT agreement appeared to be a significant achievement, but there was in some ways less to it than met the eye. The treaty mandated controlled increases, not decreases, in the Soviet arsenal, while failing to ban Devil, opment of cruise missiles, space-based weapons, or the MIRVing of existing launchers by the United States or the USSR. Thus, the superpowers sacrificed the right to defend their attack missiles with ABMs while failing to ensure the stability of mutual deterrence. In sum, the limitation of one sort of nuclear launcher, long-range missiles, did not preclude a continuing arms race in other sorts of launchers or in technological upgrades. To be sure, the mere fact of a U.S. Soviet agreement seemed of psychological value, but only if both sides were genuinely to reduce arsenals and not simply to maneuver diplomatically for a future advantage. Hence the practical value, or danger, of SALT would be revealed only by superpower behavior in years to come. End of the Vietnam War. The American achievement of détente with both Moscow and Beijing and the failure of North Vietnam's spring 1972 offensive moved both protagonists in conflict to bargain as well. In October, the secret talks in Paris between Kissinger and Lüt Duc, though finally produced an agreement on a ceasefire, the release of prisoners of war. evacuation of remaining U.S. forces within 60 days, and political negotiations among all Vietnamese parties. South Vietnam's president, Nguyen Van Thieu, then balked. The plan might indeed allow the Americans to claim peace with honor and go home, but it would leave Thieu to deal with the communists while 100,000 PAVN troops remained in his country. When North Vietnam sought to prevent any last-minute changes by releasing in public the Paris terms, Kissinger was obliged to announce on October 26 that peace is at hand. After his landslide re-election a week later, a victory aided by the prospect of peace, Nixon determined to force compliance with the terms on both Vietnamese states. Nixon ordered 11 days of intensive bombing over Hanoi itself, December 18 to 28, while sending Thieu an ultimatum threatening a separate peace and cessation of U.S. aid if Saigon did not accept the peace terms. The United States was castigated worldwide for the Christmas bombing, but when talks resumed in January, Hanoi and Saigon quickly came to terms. A Vietnam ceasefire went into effect on January 27, 1973, and the last American soldiers departed on March 29. Vietnam had been America's longest and most divisive war, and public and congressional opinion flatly opposed any resumption of the agony. The 1973 Accords, therefore, were a fig leaf hiding the fact that the United States had just lost its first war despite an estimated expenditure of $155 billion, 7,800 tons of bombs, more than all countries dropped in all of World War II, and some 58,000 American lives. Estimates of Vietnamese dead, North and South, totaled more than 2,000 soldiers and civilians. In its proportional impact on Vietnamese society, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 75, was the fourth most severe in the world since 1816. The end of U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia also brought to a close 15 years of astounding change in world politics that featured the arrival of the space and missile age, the climax of decolonization. The assertions of Maoist China and Gaullist France, the shatter of the myth, fostered by Washington and Moscow alike, of a monolithic communist world, and the relative decline of American power. In 1969, the very moment when astronauts were setting foot on the moon to fulfill Kennedy's pledge to prove American superiority, Nixon and Kissinger were struggling to adjust to the new realities and manage a limited American retreat. They succeeded brilliantly in establishing a triangular relationship with Moscow and Beijing and appear to have replaced Cold War with détente. Likewise, they appear to have escaped from Vietnam and implemented the Nixon Doctrine. New crises and reversals were in the offing. However, that would prove that the American decline had not yet been arrested. Given these reversals, détente might be judged as much an exercise in American presumption as the Vietnam War. The USSR could not be expected to cease its quest for real values in world competition just because the United States was prepared to acknowledge it as a military equal. Rather, with the United States less able to cope, that very equality opened up new opportunities for Soviet expansion. Khrushchev's boast about the new correlation of forces in the world may have brought the Soviets a series of embarrassment from 1957 to 1962, but a decade later it seemed perversely justified. The Vietnam War. In perspective, the human costs of the long conflict were harsh for all involved. Not until 1995 did Vietnam release its official estimate of war dead. As many as 2 million civilians on both sides, and some 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The U.S. military has estimated that between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C., inscribed with the names of 57,939 members of U.S. Armed Forces who had died or were mis-ING as a result of the war. Over the following years, additions to the list have brought the total past 58,200. At least 100 names on the memorial are those of servicemen who were actually Canadian citizens, among other countries that fought for South Vietnam on a smaller. Vietnam veterans look for the names of their fellow soldiers on the 20th anniversary of the opening of Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Eel Wall in Washington, D.C., 2002. Tim Sloan /AFP/Getty Images. Scale. South Korea suffered more than 4,000 dead. Thailand about 350. Australia more than 500. And New Zealand some 3 dozen. In its proportional impact on Vietnamese society, the Vietnam War, 1955 to 75, was the 4th most severe in the world since 1816. Vietnam emerged from the war as a potent military power within Southeast Asia, but its agriculture, business, and industry were disrupted. Large parts of its countryside were scarred by bombs and defoliation and laced with landmines, and its cities and towns were heavily damaged. A mass exodus in 1975 of heavily loyal to the South Vietnamese cause was followed by another wave in 1978 of boat people, refugees fleeing the economic restructuring imposed by the communist regime. Meanwhile, the United States, its military demoralized and its civilian electorate deeply divided, began a process of coming to terms with defeat in its longest and most controversial war, a process that has not yet ended. Despite the re-establishment of formal diplomatic relations between the countries in 1995,